Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on cultural and environmental wellness. My name's CJ. I'll take you through some of the content here today. Please keep in mind that this content is going to kind of branch off of a lot of what's covered in the book. So, to make sure you're successful in this week's knowledge quiz, be sure to read the text to be most prepared. All right, let's get started. Before we get too far into content, take a look around you right now. Where have you decided to watch this lecture? Perhaps you're in the library, maybe you're at home or in an apartment or dorm room, etc. Maybe even another location. Would you rather be here or somewhere else? How do we pick the places that we like to study? For instance, if you go to the library, is it because it's quiet and relaxing? Does it give you an opportunity to focus? These are the things we're going to try to discuss today when we talk about how our environment shapes our decisions and our behaviors. We normally don't give much thought to our environment or where we decide to do certain things. We just kind of naturally gravitate maybe towards the library when we're ready to study. But our environment plays a huge role in our ability to be successful in certain behaviors. For instance, it'd be much harder for you to study if you tried to crack your textbook open during the middle of a concert, right? Or maybe at a party with friends. It'd be much more difficult in that environment to focus. So, when we talk about studying environmental well being, we're looking far beyond plants and the atmosphere and recycling. Those are the things we typically think of when we hear the word environment. We today are going to use the word environment to include all people, places, and things that surround you. And that includes the things that are surrounding you right now while you watch this lecture. And so that's the concept that we want to build upon today when we're talking about environmental and cultural well being. We want to look at all the different things that surround you and understand how those directly impact your mood, your health, and your overall sense of well being. It's a concept that the ancient Greeks understood well. They put many of their hospitals and public care facilities on the edge of town or maybe out in the country quite a bit. And so if folks who are ill would leave, the pollution and the noise from the city and spend time in a quieter, more slow-paced environment for the body to kind of recoup. Okay? And that's something that modern medicine has moved away from. Once we started discovering germs and bacteria, we became much more focused on treating those bacteria, curing those illnesses, vaccines, etc. And we forgot that stress can build up and directly influence our overall health and well-being. And that's why we choose to study in the library versus in noisier, more distractful environments. You can imagine that if you were only able to study in such a stressful environment, that not only would it be harder for you to get your work done, and you'd likely see your grades deteriorate, you would also feel much more stress. And that stress therein would lead you to more illnesses. You'd be more likely to get sick. And that's why we choose to study in the library or maybe read in places that are quiet. We prefer to cook in kitchens that have plenty of room and lots of space for us to do the different things we need to do, etc. So we want to encapsulate everything that goes on around you. And I said it before that this includes much more than just plants, the atmosphere, recycling our natural resources, etc. But those play a very major role in this process. Okay, so we mentioned the ancient Greeks on the previous slide and how they moved their hospitals to the edge of town or even into the countryside. And that's because they understood that nature plays a huge role in our health. Okay, so we've listed some of the effects of spending time in nature, and these are all different things that research has shown us. Uh, but maybe apply this to yourself. Like, what are some of your favorite places to go in nature? Maybe it's a beach. We don't have many beaches in Ohio, so maybe sometimes we just like spending time in a forest, maybe near a river somewhere. Consider why you like those places. If you chose the beach, why the beach? If you chose the forest, why the forest? If it's fishing out of a river, why that? Oftentimes, we pick these settings because they're relaxing for us. They're an opportunity for us to reduce our stress. And we often feel better after having spent time in these places. So, when we talk about environmental and cultural well being, we want to understand both what environments make us feel better as well as which environments make us feel worse, right? And so, when we understand why we like certain environments or why others are stressful, we can start being more intentional about how we shape our day to day lives so we don't experience any more stress than we necessarily have to. And there's a growing body of research to support this. For instance, unfortunately, many of us at some point in our lives may have had to spend time in a hospital. Whether that was something that we were going through, maybe we were visiting someone we care about, but we might have noticed that there's a growing amount of green space around these institutions. They're including more trees and grass and ponds because they found that it's a more pleasant experience for the patients. And that makes sense. If you picture yourself not feeling well, it may be more appealing for you to look outside and to see the birds and the nature versus looking outside and seeing a busy street with horns honking and people bumping into one another as they go about their day. Research has shown that this directly influences your ability to recover from an illness, right? And this goes far beyond the hospital setting. Simply growing up in a high rise style environment where you're more likely to see graffiti and hear the noise and the honking and the whatnot leads to increased rates of crime, aggressive behavior, etc. And that's why access to green spaces are so important. They give us a place to go and to relax. You might think about the neighborhoods that maybe surround Goodale Park here in Columbus, or maybe some of our favorite green spaces here on campus. And it might make more sense as to why OSU or Columbus try to maintain those green spaces because they provide such an important function uh, for our community. So let's start building on this concept now. I think we've got a firm grasp on the fact that nature is important. But I also started this lecture we're talking about that environmental wellness is much more than just nature. So let's start weaving in aspects of culture. Okay, and to do that, let's first think about where you're from. Think about your hometown for a minute and maybe the high school you went to, etc. What was that like? How was that different than your experience now in college? For instance, I grew up in a small farming town and I had to adjust moving to Columbus, a much larger city. And where I grew up, our culture was centered around agriculture. So the sights, the smells of the equipment and the farm animals were something that we got used to and we actually started to value. And I actually missed it once I moved to Columbus. Versus some of my friends who grew up in this area and really value all the different things that are going on in a larger city, whether it's the Ohio State football games or the Clippers baseball games, all these different things. Can you think of maybe a friend that you met here that grew up in a different environment than you did? And what are some of the differences that you found? Have they introduced you to some new things? Have you introduced them to some new things? Have they broadened your horizons in some way? Well, this is kind of the foundation as to how culture is going to influence our overall well being, right? For some of us, we moved from an area that was pretty rural into Columbus, and we experienced a sense of culture shock where there were just so many differences that we kind of panicked a little bit, right? When hopefully we've adjusted well. But what we're going to do is we're going to frame this as an ecological view of wellness, right? And so we're going to look at how both the culture and the environment influence each other, but how both of those also influence you. Now, one of the models that's been developed to help us frame environmental and cultural wellness this way is Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. Okay, and so this is covered in the book, but I also have a diagram here because I think it's very important to understand. At the very center of your experience is yourself. And Bronfenbrenner focused primarily on childhood. So in the center of this diagram, you see child, but you can easily put yourself there. Now, with each additional circle or sphere, there's a different kind of environment or cultural influence, right? So immediately outside of you, we would consider your immediate family, right? As a microsystem that influences you. There might be certain things, for instance, that you're raised to do or appreciate. Maybe you're supposed to open doors for people as you walk into buildings, or maybe there are certain things you're supposed to say to certain groups of people, etc. Those are different ways in which your parents or your immediate family has kind of shaped who you are. Okay, but we can keep broadening that circle. So outside of your family, maybe you have your extended family or even the immediate community you grew up in, like we just discussed. So now at Ohio State, this would include both you as well as some of your peers that we started talking about on the previous slide. You might have taught them certain things about life where you grew up, or certain ways to handle different situations, as much as they might have introduced you to new types of food, or maybe different uh, events to attend in the city, right? And we can continue to broaden that, right? When we look at the institutional community, you might be able to think of Ohio State, for example, and how Ohio State has kind of shaped some of the things that you believe in, right? As an institution. And then even larger, you can broaden out to Columbus, the state of Ohio. You get into political and social structures, and you think about senators and governors and the president, etc. Lastly, on the farthest outside is the chronos system, and that generally just refers to time. How has time influenced all of the inner circles? Because 100 years ago, people valued different things and acted different ways just because largely it was a different time, which was an accumulation of all these different spheres. Now, not only do the outer spheres influence the inner spheres, the relationships are reciprocal. So each sphere influences one another. For instance, as much as your family might have shaped some of the things that you do or believe in, you also probably had a very significant impact on your family. And if you're not too certain, I'm sure you can go and ask members of your immediate family, and they would be able to share different ways in which you had an impact, right? If you broaden that out, maybe amongst your local community, maybe here at OSU, maybe you did some volunteering or got involved with different activities that in some way helped shape the culture of that community or this campus, right? And if we broaden out to like political and social structures, again, through voting and other bigger processes like that, there's a reciprocal engagement there, right? That continues to shape the larger spheres as well. So though we try to piece this out and break it down into different systems, each system, both large and small, influences one another to kind of create your experience today, tomorrow, in the past, future, etc. Okay? Now things will get a little more complicated, maybe a little tricky to follow, but bear with me. When using a systemic approach, it's important to understand that what may be a larger system to one person may be a smaller system to someone else. For instance, if we wanted to consider the state of Ohio, there could be many small communities that view the state of Ohio as its larger system, right? But if we zoom out, we look at and we understand that the state of Ohio is actually just one piece of an overall country, the United States. We could zoom even further and notice that it's one state of one country amongst a global community. So even though individuals may view the state as a larger system, if you change your perspective, the state becomes a much smaller piece of a much larger system. Okay? And the same goes maybe if you think of the cells that create organs that create bodies, right? Depending on how you look at it, you have certain systems that are larger than others. We would call these subsystems and suprasystems, right? So think about your immediate environment and what role you play in it, and how it could be considered both a subsystem of something larger, while also a suprasystem for certain things within it, okay? So let's apply this to your life. Now, if you considered the map from the previous slide, the state of Ohio is just one state in our country. Another state, let's say Kentucky, is a second. Those states share a horizontal relationship. right? Each of them are one equal state of a larger union. Now they have a vertical relationship with the entire country, right? With, let's say, the federal government. The federal government is larger and maybe a little higher on the totem pole than an individual state. Think about you and your peers. You may have a horizontal relationship with many of your peers. Maybe you also may have a vertical relationship with the larger community, or maybe with a professor, or someone that seems to have just a little bit of authority, right? These are different ways in which our culture and our environment start to influence us. And here I've listed a few of the others on this slide. We can consider, on a very big scale, our geography. For instance, if we grew up in a place that was considered a war zone, or maybe in a place where natural disasters were very common, we might have a very different experience of our lives rather than growing up in, let's say, rural Ohio, or maybe even Columbus, Ohio. Secondly, you can consider your job and what kind of systems exist in your job, what kind of horizontal relationships and what kind of vertical relationships you have in the workplace. Are the people there nice? Is it a well-paying job? Is it a job you can't stand? Maybe you're trading off some of the stressful aspects of your job for some of the benefits, such as the pay, or maybe some of the perks that go along with that position. So we can find many different spheres to look at these different systems of your life. We can look specifically at your social network and how maybe your social network at OSU is different than the one that you grew up with at home, but also maybe the family network and the horizontal and vertical relationships there. All of these are going to influence how you interact with your environment, okay? They'll influence you as much as you influence them. So no matter your environment or how we look at it, there are certain things individuals need in order to succeed, okay? And Abraham Maslow is one of the leading researchers in that area. Many of us might already be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but for those who aren't, you can look at the diagram here on the slide and understand that lower order needs, such as food, water, and sleep, are essential if you're going to move up this pyramid towards self-actualization, which is a point at which people are operating at their maximum potential, their full potential. So we have to meet lower order needs in order to progress. So beyond food, water, and sleep, we need a sense of safety, right? Having a home maybe to go home to, as well as love and belonging, a sense of self-worth, etc. So think about your geography. You can think about your job. You can think about your friends and your social networks here at OSU or at home, and consider whether or not they're supporting you in meeting these needs, or maybe they're challenging you by undermining some of these needs. For instance, we used the analogy of a war zone before. Growing up in a war zone might directly undermine your need for physiological support, food and water, as well as safety. It might be inherently dangerous where you're from. So certain aspects of this would be much harder for you to fulfill. And if you're not able to feel a sense of safety, or if you're not able to eat and sustain yourself, you might not ever focus on a sense of self-worth or your overall achievement. Okay? And so if we undermine some of these needs, or if there's certain things in your environment that attack these needs, they're going to take away from your ability to fully achieve your potential, okay? Or maybe meet some of the goals that you've set for yourself. Although war zones are pretty uncommon in the United States, something that is much more common is the rate of poverty. That's something that many Americans are forced to deal with. And if you consider the pyramid we saw on the previous stage, poverty directly attacks your ability to meet some of those most basic fundamental needs of human beings, right? Now, we talked about how a failure to meet those needs can extend to other areas or slow you down from achieving your potential. Well, here's a list of some of the different ways that poverty indirectly does that. Poverty will directly attack some of those basic needs for achievement, which then leads to things like unemployment, higher crime rates, etc. What's interesting, especially for some of you traditional college students, is that these effects are especially present among children and youth. For instance, certain teenagers growing up impoverished may feel additional responsibility to maybe find a job and to help earn and support their families, whereas others were more free to focus on their studies and get good grades. And so we can start to understand how your environment, especially the culture you grow up in, what the demands are within that immediate family system or even some of those larger spheres, starts to dictate some of the decisions that you're going to make, right? It's not as much of a choice for a lot of folks as much as it is circumstantial and how they feel a need to do certain things in order to meet certain needs. Now, one way to directly apply these concepts of environmental or cultural influence to your life is to look at things through the lens of gender norms or social norms. Now, if you think globally, different countries have very different traditional expectations for how men and women behave in society. Lately, those have been challenged, and so people are kind of redefining these roles or questioning whether or not they support or believe in these roles, and some do and some don't. But regardless, that's one example of how we're kind of taught how to behave in our communities, right? And it goes beyond just what boys should do or what girls should do. It's what people should do or what different groups of people should do for their community. We're socialized in our community. And if we went somewhere very different on the other side of the planet, we would find a whole different set of rules or different norms. People would be socialized completely differently. So no matter what you believe, or what kind of socialization experience you've had, the result are in groups and out groups. And so we've taught people that groups of people should do this or that. And people, whether they believe it or not, end up subscribing to a certain train of thought. And when you see people who don't fit within those rules, they're immediately a member of your out group, right? And so you and your friends probably have like a certain set of like values or things you like to do together that everybody buys into. And when you find people that don't agree or maybe don't quite fit the rules or people you're not really sure of, we immediately put them in an out group, right? That's a natural instinct to protect human beings developmentally throughout time. So consider how that then starts building and impacting your lives in other areas. Okay, if you're excluding folks from, let's say, a certain social engagement on the weekend, how does that start impacting some of those bigger and broader spheres? And how does that trickle up versus how have those spheres kind of shaped those attitudes that you have? It could be a really rewarding and interesting experience to sit and think about why you believe some of the things that you believe. Odds are we've been told by someone else or influenced by some of the things that we see in our environment to believe that way. If you stop and start thinking about some of the different attitudes that you have towards things or some of the things you like or don't like and question why, you're quickly going to stumble across the concept of power. It's a very subtle concept, but it exists in every situation that we find ourselves in. In general, we're talking about the power to make a decision, right? And so if you're thinking about power, you might use an example of a time where maybe you felt particularly helpless, like a situation was out of your control. And maybe you think back and realize that you did have a couple decisions or certain different things that you could have done, but they didn't just cross your mind at the time. Oftentimes, we're raised in an environment where people are quick to offer their advice, or our parents will help us make our decisions. Our friends are always there to lend what they believe. And that can kind of reduce this emphasis of power, the power of like personal decision making. But when you talk about being intentional about your environment or the cultural well being, it's necessary to understand that power plays an inseparable role. You can't exclude the concept of personal decision making, right? And that starts with questioning some of those concepts. As a result, We look at some folks who are in a situation and they feel helpless when an answer seems so clear to us. For instance, individuals in poverty, some may see it as from a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of attitude, where they start blaming the victim for their situation. Because in their mind, they can clearly see a solution, which is a dangerous mindset. But what we could more so focus on is emphasize this power or what people have the potential to do, right? Instead of blaming or instead of looking at negatives, we can focus on solutions and understanding our role in shaping the people we decide to spend time with, the culture of the jobs that we're at, the campuses that we study in, etc. And that's what I would encourage everyone to do, is to understand the power that they have to go out there and put themselves into a situation where the culture or the environment is supportive and supports their needs, right? Because when that's done, you'll be more likely to achieve your maximum potential. And when you do that, you'll feel better and you'll achieve a higher level of well-being. Whew, okay. So let's take a deep breath and let it out. Look around yourself one more time. After talking what we've talked about, reevaluate your current setting, your current environment. What are the people like? What's the place like? Are you happy here? If so, why? If not, why not? Think about the things that your environment can do to support you, right? Think about what your needs are. That's the first step in understanding how you can be more environmentally or culturally well. If you have time, maybe take a walk, visit some green spaces, find time to relax and de-stress. Science has shown that'll help you when you get back to your studies or back to the grind of everyday life. Hopefully, one of the things you'll take from this is the idea of power and your ability to not only directly influence your environment, but maybe those of others. There might be an opportunity for you to maybe spruce up the environment of someone else by cleaning up some things. Maybe to directly influence somebody by giving a small gift or a gift of words. Think about these things as you go through life and directly apply those to your environment and your culture. Take note of that power. Be very aware of what's going on. And then once you have that power, use it. Okay. Thank you and good luck this week on your quiz.